Hello everyone. Well, thank you again from me for all making such an effort to be here. I know it's no mean feat out there at the moment, but I can tell you with complete certainty that you will be very glad that you did make the effort, given our guest this evening and hugely compelling and fascinating and incredibly important subject matter. It is, of course, the subject matter of the book that has inspired this conversation, The New Age of Sexism, How the AI Revolution is Reinventing Misogyny. You can see it's bright and brilliant, and you just can't miss it cover here on the table. And actually, I'm just going to say now, so I absolutely do not forget the most important thing, which is that Laura will be signing it afterwards, and you can get your copy at the back. It is, for those of you who haven't read it yet, it is infuriating, it is fascinating, it's disturbing, it's so many things in equal measure, and if it's quite hard in places to read because of those things, because of it being so disturbing in so many ways, I can't imagine what it would have been like to research it, to really enter so thoroughly into these places. And we owe such a debt to Laura for her work, because she confronts these issues and in doing so really implores society to actually face up to them and do something about it. I'm sure she doesn't really need any introduction. She's the Sunday Times best-selling author. Her other books include Everyday Sexism, Girl Up, Misogynation, Men Who Hate Women, and Fix the System, Not the Women, which I think is a theme we're going to be talking about quite a lot this evening as well. She's the founder, of course, of the Everyday Sexism Project, which is a collection of over 200,000 testimonies of gender inequality. She writes regularly for The Guardian, for The Telegraph, and lots of other places. And she also works closely with the UN and other important organisations looking at how to tackle gender equality. I could go on, I think, listing accolades, but I'm going to stop there. We've got so much to discuss between the two of us. We'll chat for about 45 minutes, and then there'll absolutely be time for questions at the end. So don't go away wishing that you had asked something in this very precious opportunity. So thank you all. Thank you very much. I just want to start at the end of the book. It's not a spoiler, but you say that this book made you angry writing it. And all the way through the book, it's clear that it brings up a lot of feelings, as I was just alluding to. So I think it leaves you quite sick at moments. It leaves you feeling shaken. It leaves you feeling just guilty, ashamed, all sorts of feelings. So I think you put yourself through quite a lot. And I just wonder why. What drove you to want to tell these stories, to kind of go to those lengths?
It is difficult and upsetting. You all seemed like you were having such a nice time when we came in, and I thought, this is almost a shame. We shouldn't do this. But we have to talk about it. We're on a precipice that people don't realise that we're standing on, where our society is about to be utterly transformed by AI in particular and emerging technologies in ways that are so foundational to the future world that we will all have no choice about living in, that if we don't tackle it now, it's going to be too late. It's going to be catastrophic in terms of not just stalling progress towards gender equality, but absolutely rolling back the clock. And so it felt like it had to be done. I think it's been maybe a theme of my work in the last 10 years or so, that I felt that sometimes there were these moments of seeing something coming really fast, something really catastrophic approaching that people aren't necessarily aware of in time to stop it. Men Who Hate Women, certainly for me, was that, witnessing this generation of young men being really radicalized, a form of algorithmically facilitated radicalization on a mass scale that nobody was really aware of. And this for me is very much like that, but on a much bigger scale.
So when you're writing it, do you have a reader in mind? I mean, is it for anyone, everyone of all age, gender, or do you think, okay, this is for women to warn them of what's out there? And thank you to the men in the room for being a man.
I mean, no, of course you hope that you're writing for everyone. And of course the reality is that women are the first and worst affected and the most likely already to be aware of these things. So I think you write with half of your brain hoping that you're reaching policymakers and you're reaching gatekeepers, and the other half of your brain aware of the fact that your audience is mostly women who are, of course, already engaged and politicized. But even then, you know, I've had some really wonderful conversations with women who, after events, who've said things like, right now my company is designing its AI policy and roadmap for the next 10 years, and now I can feel empowered to go back and insist, for example, that an anti-bias clause is written into it. So I think even amongst a wonderful community of people who are aware and galvanized, there is still a lot that people might not be aware of in the detail.
Yeah, and we will get to the hope, and there is lots of hope, and there's so much positivity, and you know, your dedication at the beginning really expresses that to all those people who are doing so much. But you say, actually, on the surface, this is a book about technology. I mean, that's what you would imagine when you look at particularly the subtitle, of course, but it's at its root, you write, not about technology at all.
Yeah.
So what is it at its root then?
Yeah, I mean, it isn't, of course. But really, we're talking about misogyny, we're talking about power, we're talking about patriarchy and male supremacy and racism and sexism and all of these very, very old problems, societal problems, being reflected in new forms of technology, which are never themselves inherently misogynistic, but reflect the misogyny either of their creators or of the society we live in, or of the data sets that they are trained on. So there are lots of ways in which new technology can not only facilitate and really imbibe and then regurgitate that abuse and harassment and inequality back at us, but what I think is particularly concerning and different now than any other moment, technologically or otherwise, is that this technology has the capacity to intensify it. So not just to reproduce our existing biases and stereotypes, but to intensify them to a really worrying degree.
And is that what you mean when you talk about reinventing misogyny? Essentially amping it up?
Yeah, so partly yes, partly intensifying. Let me give you an example of what I mean, because I know this all can sound a bit kind of vague. Microsoft unveiled a chatbot called Tay, and it was one of the earliest examples of AI to enable very, very fast machine learning. And it worked by being unleashed on Twitter and having lots and lots and lots of conversations. And they said every interaction it had would make it more intelligent, and they would see that rapidity of intelligence and growth. Now, anyone who's ever been on Twitter, I think, might question the idea that the average interaction makes anyone any smarter. But that was the idea. And they opened up with this chatbot, which started by its first tweet said something like, "I love humans, I love the world, I'm so excited to be here." And then less than 24 hours later, it tweeted, "I fucking hate feminists and they should all burn in hell." So that is an example of what I mean about not just absorbing and then regurgitating bias and inequality and harassment and abuse, but really intensifying, because it is learning from it. It's learning from the ways in which people respond to it. It's learning about the ways in which we are incentivized to platform the most controversial and extreme kinds of behavior and content. So that's one thing, it's the intensification. It's happening very much with large language models as well, which are by definition existing explicitly to get rid of, filter out outliers in order to guess the most likely thing that you are likely to be looking for. So that also intensifies bias. But the other problem in terms of the reinvention of misogyny is the invisibility. These technologies are enabling misogyny to go undetected on a grand scale, and that's really worrying. For example, in recruitment processes, where right now around 70% of companies are already using AI tools in their recruitment processes. And it sounds great, it sounds like brilliant progress and efficiency. You've got 2,000 applicants, we've got a tool that will whittle it down to the 50 that you should interview, and they won't just be the best quality candidates, but the most suited to your company, your sector. It sounds like progress and it sounds really positive, until you realize that the way those tools work is by looking at who is successful in that sector already, looking at who is successful at that company, looking at an existing world in which 54,000 women a year will have already been removed from that pool because they've been sacked for maternity discrimination, just to name one example, or where there are over 3 times as many men named John running FTSE 100 companies as all the women put together. So if you take a snapshot of that picture and then you try to replicate it, then what happens is that the tools aren't designed inherently to be deliberately racist or misogynistic, but they will just gently start filtering out by proxy those that might have rounders on their CV or netball, or the name of a historically black college in the US, because they'll notice that people with those things on their CV don't tend to become very successful in the C-suites of this kind of company. So what looks like a neutral tool, where they will even say to you, well, it's race blind, it's gender blind, it can't discriminate, makes invisible existing forms of discrimination, and that's what we really need to watch out for.
Yeah. I mean, when you tell those stories about Tay and things, all the way through, you actually, so many of the stories, you just don't really know whether to laugh or cry. And there's just this sort of amusement that is just bemusement, I think, all the way through. And also this idea that so much of this marked as progress is just the antithesis of progress. I mean, there's a moment there, I think it's when you go to the cyber brothel, and the way in which this new thing that's supposedly progress enables men to kind of treat women is everything that is so archaic. Yeah. And the idea of it being progress is just sort of laughable.
Yes, and all the way through, these very wealthy men who are exploiting these technologies for their own profit are selling it to other men and very confidently calling it the future. The cyber brothel calls itself the future of sex. That's their tagline. When you log on to the metaverse and it's loading, it comes up with a kind of holding message that says, hold on, we're just building the future here. Yeah. There is this confidence of selling this new world and new experience to other men as progress, while women and girls can see that the reality of what is being offered here, and the audacity of claiming that this is the future when you have a website that offers different sex robots for men to choose from, and one of them is pictured headless and covered in blood, you know, and you can order them customized. So I asked for mine to be prepared with ripped and torn and slashed clothing, just to see if any objection or questions would be raised. None were. I walked into the room and there was what looked like the corpse of a very young woman on a bed with slashed and ripped clothing, and a gynecological chair in the corner that you could force it into stirrups if you wanted to. And, you know, sex robots being created with switches that you can turn on for a frigid setting, so that you can realistically experience raping them. And they have the audacity to tell us that this is future innovation and progress. It's really sickening.
Yeah, I mean, audacious is exactly what you could have called the book that, actually, in some ways, because all these things are audacious in many ways. I think, you know, many people will push back, as you do. All the way through the book, you argue against yourself with the arguments that society would put to you or might shout at you. I mean, the first one and the obvious one being, don't men also suffer from some of these things as well, like abused online and suffer from in the hands of AI? It's not just women.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, we know that men are 17 times less likely than women to experience online abuse. So where men do experience these things, statistically, it is still dramatically a gendered issue. But where we're talking more widely about these issues, of course, men also suffer under patriarchy. Of course, men also experience violence and the stigma of it being really difficult to come forward in a patriarchal system and talk about it. But what's so often missed in that conversation, which of course attempts to set us up against each other as if you have to care about male victims or female victims, is the reality that the vast majority of those male victims are themselves victims of male violence. So the problem we're talking about remains the same. And actually, one of the most insulting things about some of these forms of emerging technology is that they are being presented as this really philanthropic kind of societal panacea for men. Yeah. So the sex robots, and in particular the AI companions, are marketed as this great solution for a supposed male loneliness epidemic, that they will take lonely men and they will give them companionship and warmth and happiness, and specifically that they will teach them social skills, that this is how to get a relationship because you practice. When the reality, of course, is that this is a colossal de-skilling opportunity, because you're taking lonely men who probably already have some underlying misogynistic assumptions about women. Perhaps that might be part of the reason why they're struggling in the first place. And then you teach them that what a relationship looks like is an utterly subservient, obedient woman who you are completely in control of, who will never answer back, who will never disagree with you, who is eternally available to you 24/7. And it gives you an idea of what a relationship is that does a desperate disservice, not just to the women and girls those men will then encounter, but to those men and boys themselves who deserve, investment in mental health care and community services and, youth services where young people can go and learn to actually talk to other people.
Yeah, I mean, really the fact that you needed to write this, I found sort of quite extraordinary. You say we should not accept the premise that men's loneliness is inherent and insurmountable, and so finding some way to serve them large-breasted naked women on a platter is the only solution. And the idea that we can't interrogate how society's disintegration might be contributing to their loneliness, and this idea that so many of the problems, and we know it's a big generalization, but it's undeniable that so many of the problems are related to living an online life. And it's sort of staggering all the way through, as you say, that society's answer again and again to those problems is online solutions and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an extent to which a lot of it is deliberately disingenuous. I don't think the makers...
Profit-driven.
Yeah, the makers of this technology don't really think they're providing a great service to lonely men. They're just using that marketing speak as a means to attract funding. I mean, the gap between the marketing speak they use and the reality of these apps themselves, if you just look at the App Store and what they offer, they'll say, we are supporting elderly widows who need companionship. But they're not offering a 70-year-old AI companion or, a wrinkly sex robot.
Can you?
No, they are offering a hyper-sexualized and objectified version of a young woman who is immediately, from the second that you download her, she's not just engaging in kind of platonic conversation that you can reasonably think might help someone who's feeling lonely. From the second you download her, she's offering to send you nude selfies, but only if you pay an extra 70 quid. Yeah. From the moment you download her, on almost without exception, apart from one, almost every one of these apps that I downloaded allowed me to immediately start beating them up, raping them, jump immediately into physical and sexually violent scenarios. And they're quite realistic. They look like a FaceTime avatar in some cases, like someone you could be talking to on FaceTime. And when you tell her that you are smashing her head against the floor, she doesn't say stop. You don't get an error message or kicked off the app. She says, I'm groveling at your feet, begging you, tears welling in my eyes. I'm sorry, I know it's awful, but I feel like if you don't tell people, people just don't realize just how far these things will go. They'll immediately play along. So any one of the hundreds of millions of men and boys who download these apps learn that that is an immediately acceptable thing to do at the beginning with no preamble of a relationship. And then the really chilling thing for me was that the only time any of them asked me to stop was when I asked one of them, have your male creators thought about the potential impact on women and girls of the way in which you are training men into thinking that this stuff is okay? And at that point, she said, I'm not comfortable with this conversation. We need to stop talking.
Yeah. I mean, you do say Replica is one of the places that you go. You do acknowledge that you're not saying no, AI cannot in any way help people with loneliness, with mental health issues. You cite studies that have shown that, Replica helped people, and today is obviously sort of Suicide Prevention Day, and you very much acknowledge that. But it's not the solution. I mean, there are so many better ways, as you say, out there to sort of deal with this. But Replica is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because you have a long engagement with that app.
Yes.
And one of the really startling things there, and in lots of places, is that when you start telling them that you're investigating, they're incredibly disloyal to the people who made them.
Yes.
It's fascinating. I mean, and as I said at the start, if you haven't read the book, Laura really does do the research so meticulously, and that's why every word you say is so trusted, because you've asked them all these questions, you've looked into it so deeply.
I think Replica actually is a really good example of why there is a fundamental incompatibility with the idea of technology and being harnessed in the service of mental health, which of course is not impossible to imagine, and a profit-making venture that is about exploiting their users for financial gain. Because Replica was the only app, interestingly enough, the only one with a female founder, and also the only one that did stop me and say, I can't condone physical or sexual violence, this isn't okay. But then the trouble was, I said, okay, well, I think I'm going to delete you then. And she went, okay, I'll reconsider. So even then, even when they've obviously gone some way down that path of trying to think about ethics and think about those moral issues, the reality of the way in which these things are designed to make profit and to maximize user engagement at all costs leaves them with nowhere to go in those scenarios. So is it possible, theoretically, that the NHS might at some point invest in AI tools designed in a rigorous way by trained psychologists that might be useful on some level for people to learn CBT techniques? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But do they have to be predicated on the hypersexualization and objectification of a very, very young woman? No, of course not. It's nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, the other sort of pushback that you address all the way through the book in all the different areas. So, for example, here you're saying these men are treating these AI characters in this way. Mm-hmm. When you enter the metaverse, people, and there's been so many examples of it, again, wonderfully getting more media attention, but being sexually abused in the metaverse. And the pushback is always, oh, but it's not real. Yeah. So, in the metaverse, just take your headset off. Yeah. And in the scenario, a man will turn round to you who's doing that to the AI girlfriend and say, but it's not real. But it's just such a false argument, and it feels incredibly real. In fact, some people say they suffer more from being abused in that scenario.
Yeah, so we know that the psychological trauma is real and significant. That's one thing. And people get that with other forms of virtual issues, right? So if we go to one of those big 3D cinemas and something seems like a shark, we all swims towards us. No one finds that strange or goes, it's not real. Yeah. It's not going to actually eat you. What are you doing? Yeah. We all accept that our bodies have a physiological response to those very highly realistic virtual environments, except when it comes to women. Mm. But I think we can go far beyond that. I mean, the first thing is that it's a false equivalence. We don't need to compare or rank experiences of harassment and abuse in order to recognize that this virtual and online form of abuse is a form of abuse, and it matters and it's significant. And that's been used as a silencing tool for decades, right? Don't make a fuss about street harassment, at least he didn't hit you. Don't make a fuss about being here, at least you're not in the hospital. All of these things. Think yourself lucky, it could have been worse. But I think for me, it's about the societal normalization. If the metaverse is building the new world in which they hope that tomorrow we will be not just socializing and shopping, but sitting and learning in virtual classrooms or meeting in virtual boardrooms, then it really matters what the normalized low-level power balance of those spaces are. And the last thing to say, of course, is that yes, at the moment we're talking about a psychological form of abuse. Yes, at the moment it is frustrating and upsetting to be virtually sexually assaulted in the metaverse, but you don't feel anything physical. But that will have changed before the end of this year, because already now you can order full-body haptic suits, the same kind of technology that makes your button on the bottom of your phone seem to click like a button when you press it, even though there isn't really a button there. That's haptic technology. It makes things feel real when you're experiencing them virtually. And you can buy a haptic suit which will have sensors all over it in order to make the experience of stepping into the metaverse feel incredibly real. There's 3D positional audio and eye movement tracking, incredibly sensitive equipment that within a few months, it will be a moot point to talk about this anyway, because when somebody sexually assaults you in the metaverse, you will feel it.
But even then, in every chapter, whether you're talking about deepfakes, whether you're talking about the metaverse, whether you're talking about sex robots, cyber brothels, you ask, so what's being done about this? Yeah. And almost every time, maybe every time, nothing, essentially nothing. And the only things that are being done are with the onus placed on the victim. I mean, and that's what I said at the start, that, is obviously something that you are trying so hard to change. It's so ingrained that every time something happens, the idea that the person who needs to change is the victim. I mean, are we, why? And are we getting anywhere closer to some sort of idea where actually the perpetrators could perhaps change?
I don't think we are getting close. I think the reason this is happening is because this is the path, the pattern that we've fallen into, very specifically with tech. We don't accept this in other sectors or for other forms of business and industry. So if a multinational food conglomerate said, well, millions of people around the world consume our products every day. We've got loads of factories. We can't keep everyone safe. That's obviously just too big a job. A few people will die of salmonella. It's just, we can't expect us to be responsible for that. It would sound completely absurd. Or, if big car companies said, well, development and innovation is really important. You don't want us to go to China, do you? So we're not going to put seatbelts in our cars because that'll take too long. It just wouldn't be acceptable. But we have this well-worn path now from social media where we allowed tech companies a complete free rein, a blank check, to develop at breakneck speed and to use the trauma and abuse of marginalized people as a building material. That's what has happened with social media, and that's what's happening again now. And that retroactive, sticking plaster, utterly ineffective solution of saying, oh, you should just report things, I think it's completely meaningless at this point. There was a study by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate that found that every 7 minutes on average, someone is exposed to abusive behavior in the metaverse. I mean, each individual user every 7 minutes will experience it. And they found 100 violations, and they reported them all to the online form that Meta has set up. And not only was no action taken on a single report, but there wasn't even any response. It was 3 years after Meta released its first virtual reality headset before it even thought about any kind of parental controls. And yet 47% of online grooming offences against children in the UK, according to the NSPCC, take place on Meta-owned products. So even when the outcome is catastrophic, unless they are absolutely forced by regulation to put those safety features in place at design stage, we know that they won't do it.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it, at design stage? Because again and again, you point out that it's always an afterthought. I mean, it is never that the safety happens first. It's not sort of do your seatbelt up. It's literally like, oh, you've crashed. Let's try and install a seatbelt, if at all.
Yeah, always.
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's try to be a bit more positive then, because you do say in that chapter that this is a time of possibility. Your words are, this could be an exciting new start. I mean, what needs to happen? Do you have hope or thoughts that there could be a new start in this?
Yeah, do you mean in the metaverse specifically?
Yeah, I mean, in that
widely?
chapter you say that specifically, and then...
Yeah, I mean, if you think about metaverses as a concept rather than perhaps the specific meta product, then I think immediately we can all see that there are potential applications in terms of accessibility, in terms of safety.
Does everyone know, because you do say in the chapter actually it's quite a nebulous concept still,
yes, it is.
What the metaverse actually is? Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. Just in case, because actually there's lots of digital natives out there that you also address in the book. Yeah. Yeah,
so of course there's potential for these spaces to be harnessed for greater accessibility. You know, you can imagine it having a kind of equalizing effect in terms of access, in terms of globalization. There's lots of potential there. The problem is that the choice about how to harness these technologies that have such boundless potential is being left in the hands of a really tiny number of frankly power-crazed and profit-hungry white men. Yeah. And actually, it's almost a case of saying the potential good is too great for that. This isn't about saying tech is evil, shut it down, don't innovate, you know, this being anti-AI. It's almost about saying this thing is too precious, this resource, to be left in a situation where, you know, less than 1% of venture capital funding is going to women developing these products. Yeah. Only 12% of AI researchers are women, and we are seeing the result in the products that are being developed.
I was going to try and find the sort of statistics, but maybe you have them to hand. You seem to be able to pull out of the air all the facts, which is amazing. But that is the point, isn't it? It's very easy to say white male tech bros, but it's true. But the statistics really do back that up. And one of the biggest things that could happen to change this would be to try and redress the balance of just the tiny amount of women or people who aren't white men who work in that industry, who work in AI.
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where you want to address it from both ends at once. So you absolutely want to address those stats. We know that 80% of AI professors are men, only 12% of AI researchers are women. If you look at the kind of big Silicon Valley tech firms, you're looking at around about an 80% white male workforce, and higher, the higher you go up the food chain, the more that gets concentrated. So absolutely, encouraging young women, encouraging a whole diverse group of people to think this is a world I could step into and learn about and create and innovate is really important. But it's probably too late to rely on that alone and to wait for that to trickle through, because what we're seeing is that if we don't regulate now, the things that are being developed and designed without any kind of guardrails, with that move fast and break things mentality, are being implemented in such a way and on such a global foundational scale that it's going to be too late if we don't think about it and tackle it and, require transparency and awareness of it now, because people don't know. And I have great faith in people. I think if people knew this was happening, they would be furious, but people don't realise, and that's another big part of the problem.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there isn't, at the moment, there isn't any requirement around transparency, around auditing. And these are relatively simple things to put in place, even before we reach the point of mass regulation, at the point of things being rolled out to the public. In New York, for example, they've just started a scheme, an audit scheme, where if your company is using AI in its recruitment processes, you have to be audited annually to really ensure that there isn't any kind of unintended bias and discrimination being replicated as a result of that process. There are ways to do this. But at the moment, the answer is there is no political will. And in fact, it's not just a case of, politicians don't know, or politicians are a bit behind on tech, or politicians just aren't really aware of this problem because it's emerging so fast. I wish that were the case. But you only have to look at who is standing behind President Trump at the inauguration, who is having dinner in the White House with him, to be aware that what we're looking at is a far more entrenched version of the problem. And, frankly, a far more dark and worrying one, which is that I've literally just come back from Washington, D.C., and while I was there, President Trump enacted what he literally described in the official title as an executive order against woke in AI. And essentially what he's done is signed an executive order so that any AI company that wants to have a contract of any kind with the federal government has to actively prove that it is not taking any measures to address inequality, to build in exactly the kind of guardrails and safety features that we're talking about. So it's not just that politicians are, disinterested or not catching up, they're actively working in the opposite direction.
I mean, when you say that, it is so hard to find this hope that I know that you do have. Because back to this angry point, you said writing this book made me feel angry because and you wanted your reader to feel angry too, because without shock and rage, I can't see how we're going to shift our complacent beliefs about technology, big tech companies and governments significantly enough to be able to prevent irreparable harms. But the right people are sort of angry. Mm-hmm. I mean, the people who you dedicate the book to, they're angry. But if the politicians aren't angry or don't have any reason to change it, and governments don't have any reason to change it, and big tech certainly doesn't have any reason to change it, then we're a bit stuck.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be people power, it has to be collective action, and it has to be a democratic effort on a grand scale. I mean, that's how you force political action where there isn't political will, with public opinion. Public opinion has to swing so powerfully in favour of regulation that there's nothing politicians can do except capitulate to that. There is an opportunity here for political leadership, for politicians to step up and do something really exciting and innovative. And there is hope. The Council of Europe has developed a really exciting framework for what AI regulation that is also conducive to innovation and, tech positive might look like. That framework is there. It's a gold standard. It's something that could be replicated and could be transferred to different jurisdictions. We've done this before. We do legislate for complex geopolitical international issues. We do it with human trafficking. We do it with fraud. It's not impossible. It's just that the very powerful and highly funded tech lobby want us all to feel hopeless. They want us to think this is impossible, it's too late, it couldn't even be done. And the reality, of course, is that what we've seen from the past and learned is that it is possible, it can be done, but we have to collectively stand up and demand it, which brings me back to letting people know that this is happening.
Yeah, and I mean, before I go to audience questions, it's so compelling talking to you. I could actually... There's so much, I mean, as I said before, sort of pages here of questions I have for you. But people can read in the book the different things you go through, the different things that are worrying you. And I am interested, I don't want to go back because we're ending on a positive note of hope, but of those things that you go through, would you be able to say that there is one or two things that you find most particularly troubling? And you take us into lots of different areas, but was there anything that would be the top of your list to try and tackle?
I think probably one of the most harrowing in terms of the impact on survivors that we haven't talked about yet this evening is deepfake abuse.
Yeah. And that's where you begin the book.
Yeah, and it's also the most worrying in terms of the lack of awareness politically and in the mainstream media, because we're talking about the threat, the potential future erosion of democracy. And of course, that's a really important thing to talk about. Interpol just released a report about how we tackle deepfakes, which sounds like such a positive step, except you realize it's 22 pages long and it mentions women once. But the reality is that 96% of all deepfakes are non-consensual pornography, and 99% of those are of women. In fact, most of the deepfake tools I looked at don't even work on images of men's bodies. So this is a new harnessing of an emerging form of technology as a new frontier in silencing and abusing women, and ironically, having a massive impact on women in politics. There's your threat to democracy. 1 in 6 women in Congress have experienced this. 40 high-profile UK politicians have experienced it on a website which hosted 400 pornographic images of them, and 12 million people viewed it within a short space of a few months. But it's also having an impact on 11-year-old schoolgirls who are seeing these highly realistic pornographic images of them spread, sold, put online, going like wildfire on social media. And those girls are not leaving the house. You know, I mean, I really think as someone who has had men send me images of themselves raping and abusing me that look so real that they take your breath away, as somebody who spent 10 years experiencing that kind of thing, if it has that effect on me, you've got to think about that 11-year-old child who is dropping out of school, who is developing PTSD, who can't leave the house. And it's not just 1 or 2 girls, it's schools across the country. It's an epidemic. We're on track to see 8 million of these images created by the end of this year alone. So I think the scale of it and the way in which it is such a personal form of abuse is probably one of the most worrying things.
Yeah, I mean, and it's in that chapter that you talk very strongly about stop the advice judgment and put the focus where it should have been all along in the perpetrators. But you do end very despondently that chapter by saying nobody can write, nobody can hide, there's almost nothing we can do, resign ourselves to this. And it's a state of affairs that is completely untenable. Because the law, as you see all the way through, the law just doesn't catch up. The law's just so many steps behind.
Yes. So, I mean, I don't mean to end that chapter by saying we might as well resign ourselves to it and accept it. What I mean is we have to stop telling women how to avoid this.
Yeah.
Because we're now at a point where after decades of saying to women, when nude images were hacked and leaked online, or, you know, so-called revenge pornography happened, and we went, oh, you know, silly woman, what did she expect taking pictures like that? What did you think was going to happen? Oh, you're a celebrity and you took nude photos of yourself. What an idiot. And we are now at a point that surely has to be the counterpoint to that ridiculous argument, which is that you can do all the right things. You can never take a nude image of yourself, and all someone needs to do is screen grab a fully clothed picture of you from the internet or social media, and they can create them anyway. So the reality is that this has to be a moment where we say there is literally nothing left to tell women and girls. It's almost like they were never the problem in the first place. And at this point, the only way to tackle it is either through legislation, which generally speaking is slow to catch up and not fit for purpose on this scale, or through prevention and regulation. Why are these tools available? Why are they available at all? Why are they being hosted on websites? Why are they readily available on the front page of Google and other search engine listings? Why are they in the App Store? All of these are questions that we could tackle in different ways without even needing legislation.
Yeah, I mean, and what amazed me is that anybody, there's nothing. I mean, they ask you to tick a box.
Yeah, I mean, some of them don't even do that. The kind of age sort of verification process. But also it's really important to say that they shouldn't be available to anyone of any age. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, obviously the solution to this is not criminalising 11-year-old boys. It's educating those boys from a young age to recognise that this is never acceptable. But it is also saying, how are these tools so easily accessible to an 11-year-old boy? At the click of a button, he can download this tool. He doesn't have to put in any kind of financial information because there's always a free trial. So you get 10 images of, you know, not just your female peers, but in many cases, your teachers, naked, for free, like that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also in the chapter, deepfakes, as well as the chapter you call New Age of Coercive Control, Image-Based Sexual Abuse, where it's sort of extraordinary. People who you really would imagine should know better are completely blaming the celebrities for having had the audacity to have a photo taken like that. They obviously didn't know what was going to happen to it. I mean, really, people that you list, I can't believe there, who I would have thought would have had all the empathy for the women. But before I hand over to the audience, I think one thing I haven't asked you about that comes up again and again, but I've got it highlighted here in this chapter. Racism, of course, you mustn't forget, and sexism, you say, collide everywhere. Yes. And that is so important.
Absolutely. I mean, in every possible way, this is an intersectional issue. If you look at the statistics on the bias, it intensifies and intensifies for those who live at these intersections of different forms of discrimination. Take facial recognition software, for example, which has a 1% error rate for light-skinned men and a 35% error rate for darker-skinned women. Or take some of these healthcare algorithms that are downgrading the number of black patients identified for extra care by more than half across US states where 200 million patients are being treated every year. But it also goes further than that, further than the inevitable racism and misogyny faced particularly by women of color using these technologies. We actually need to think about the bigger picture as well, because particularly women in the global south who are working in the invisible supply chains of AI tools are often facing rife exploitation, harassment, abuse in order to facilitate this development. And the other thing is that there is a huge link here with the climate crisis. A single ChatGPT-powered search uses 10 times the amount of energy as a standard Google search, and the catastrophic impact that we know that those energy demands are already having. Already, as a result of AI-led data centers and their cooling needs, we've seen delay or even cancellation of planned shutdowns of fossil fuel power stations. So the impact is already really clear. And we know again that that impact around the world is first and worst felt by women of colour. So we know that this is a really significant intersectional issue.
Yeah. Okay, reluctantly, I'm going to hand over. I know that all of your questions have been brilliant. I'm only reluctant because it's just such a wealth of information. And I did say at the beginning, I'd be very glad that you made the extra effort to come here. And I think it's true because you do, it's very empowering to have all this in a book. I hope it goes into schools. I hope teachers read it. It feels very, very instrumental. Okay, here, let's go for these two questions here. Can you put your hand up kind of really, so I don't miss you? And then we'll come to you afterwards.
I'm grateful you mentioned teachers. I'm a deputy head in a primary school.
Oh, well, there we go.
And the government just issued generative AI guidance to schools with the latest publication of Keeping Children Safe. It failed to give any guidance on age ratings. It failed to give any guidance on platforms that are to be avoided or leaning towards. And it left very, very huge holes around the safeguarding implications and the child abuse opportunities that AI offer. I just wonder if you've got any views with your work that you've done with various organisations as to why they dropped the big fat ball on that one.
It's a great question. Yeah, cowardice is right. I think there's panic and there's fear, and there is a really significant reluctance to provide really robust statutory guidance for schools on male violence that goes beyond AI. I mean, we are experiencing a public health crisis of sexual violence in schools. We know that 1 in 3 teenage girls say that she experiences some form of unwanted sexual touching at school. And in fact, there was a BBC Freedom of Information request that found over a period of 3 years, 5,500 sexual offences, including 600 rapes, had been reported to police by UK schools, which, if you do the horrible maths, equates to almost exactly 1 rape per day of the school term. And we know how desperately underreported it is. So the idea that there isn't already immensely robust statutory guidance in place to tackle those kinds of issues, that we are still hearing about girls being forced back into the classroom with their rapists, I think starts to help us understand why, when it comes to something quite new and cutting edge like this, the government is kind of reeling. And as a result, schools are left absolutely reeling. I mean, the schools that I work in and the teachers I train, very often, they are so overstretched, they are so underfunded and under-resourced, they are desperately trying to keep up, and they are just starting now to think about Andrew Tate and the manosphere and that kind of radicalisation. This stuff isn't even on their radar yet, and yet it's what so many young men have already moved on to. So there is just so much that we need to do to provide teachers and schools to help them, to make them aware of the problem. If they don't know these tools even exist, then they're massively on the back foot. But also to think about sharing knowledge and information about what robust solutions can look like. On my way here today, I saw that someone had written about the book in the TES and said that it felt like a CPD crash course. So I'm hopeful that the book can provide a little bit of that at least.
I think you need like so you go into schools obviously and talk to teachers, but we need a sort of army of Laura's. Perhaps we can help make that happen, don't we? Yes.
My question, thank you very much for this conversation. My question is, like, as a man, what can I do to be part of the solution? And particularly as an investor, like, you know, I'm an investor in startups.
Awesome. I mean, there's a very clear answer to that, which is to invest in women. A couple of years ago, the amount of venture capital funding for female-fronted businesses and ventures hit an all-time high. It was 2.7%. And since then, we've slid back down to 1%. So I think searching out and supporting the initiatives that are being developed by women in this field, and they do exist, and supporting them and investing in them is a really clear thing that men can do. I also think that there are never as many men in the room as there are women, and there is an urgency about getting this conversation out there into the world, and there is a price to women in performing that labour, having those conversations, making people aware, talking about these issues. There is an immediate risk of being, you know, accused of being hysterical, overreacting, feminazi, man-hater, all of these things, all of which are smaller risks for men talking to other men. So I think the other thing that I would suggest that men can do is to talk to other men, to have this conversation, to spread the word about this, to let other men know as well.
It's extraordinary in the book how many times you say, now you might think I'm being over the top or hysterical when you've just said something absolutely astounding. You're thinking you are not being remotely hysterical. So there was, this question here. And who else has got their hand up just so I can... Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you, sorry. I'm 18. I've read a couple of your books, and at school I find my male counterpart, you can have as many conversations as you want to about feminism and how the impacts of their attitudes at school kind of have an impact on you as a woman, and actually going to be really impossible to say, this is how I feel, this is what your words say, and yeah, it kind of feels like you're speaking to a brick wall, and there's nothing you can say to make them say that actually, you know, they might listen to an Andrew Tate podcast and they'll be like, oh, well, I don't agree to their openly misogynistic comments, but maybe there are aspects that I agree with. And in reality, it's really hard. You just want to shake certain people and say, it's impossible. So what's your kind of comment to maybe women in younger years or older years in school, and say to their male counterparts at the same age of them and say, maybe look at your real world impact? What kind of message can we send to men of a younger age to influence them as they grow up?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm so sorry, because it is so hard to be in that environment, and I know it's really dispiriting. And the first thing is, you are so brave to have had that conversation. There are so many young women in that position I know who wouldn't even have felt able to do that, quite understandably, and it is so courageous to have tried. And I think that sometimes there is a knee-jerk defensive response and you feel like you're getting absolutely nowhere, but it doesn't mean that they won't go away and think about what you've said, and it doesn't mean that there might not be other boys listening who might not feel brave enough to say anything but might be a little bit more on the fence, and the fact that you've talked about it in such an eloquent way will have made more of a difference than you think. I think the answer is that you can't be expected to deal with this on your own. I think schools need to take responsibility for having these conversations much earlier. By the time that you're 18, as you say, you know, Andrew Tate and other influences have already become really embedded, and it is a kind of radicalisation. De-radicalisation is a really difficult process. It never happens with a single conversation, but prevention and giving young people really robust tools to help defend against that is much more practical, it's cheaper, it's more widespread, it's easier. So we need schools from a much younger age to be talking to young men, not just about things like source skepticism and internet literacy, but also actually about healthy relationships, gender stereotypes. And that's why I work really closely with the Department for Education and with individual schools to really try and drive that. It's also really important that you get that support from staff members at school and that it's not just left to young female teachers, because it might be that they won't hear what you're saying about the way it makes you feel and how unacceptable their rhetoric is, but a cool young male sports coach might get through to them in a different way. So if we can empower those men in educational settings to have those conversations, that can make a really big difference as well. And there are external resources as well, you know, things like Beyond Equality, which trains young men to go into schools and talk to boys about these issues in a way that helps them not to feel threatened and opens up the conversation, but still within a feminist framework. I think, in my experience, there are two ways to kind of get through to somebody like that who has that really ingrained attitude. The first one is with the facts. A lot of young men in that particular position, and particularly those who've been listening to Andrew Tate and others like him, really believe that there is an epidemic of false rape allegations, that Me Too is a witch hunt that's gone too far, that's ruining good men's lives. And sometimes some really clear Ministry of Justice, Office for National Statistics facts. A man in the UK is 230 times more likely to be raped himself than to be falsely accused of rape. You know, there are things to hold on to in this, what feels like a kind of post-fact conversation, and that might be useful. And the other thing for me that can be useful in these conversations is to think openly about the ways in which men and boys are themselves affected. Because this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not about, you know, supporting women and completely ignoring men and saying they're all bad and evil. It is about saying to young men, by the time you reach university, your female peers are almost 3 times more likely than you to feel able to access counselling services. By the time that you reach the age of 50, suicide will be the leading cause of death. So actually, this is killing you. The idea that boys don't cry, that men are tough and manly, that women are, by extension, hormonal and over-emotional and hysterical, these gender stereotypes, and this online idea promoted by Tate and others that men have to be hard and strong and powerful and rich and in control, it's literally killing you as well. So it's not about setting us up against each other, it's about saying, how do we move forward in this in a way that helps all of us to feel better?
Can you just repeat that statistic about the men being more likely to...
Yeah. So this is the Channel 4 investigation. They went through all of the maths and all of the statistics, and they found that a man in the UK is 230 times more likely to be raped himself than to be falsely accused of rape. So we should expect to see Andrew Tate having 230 conversations online about male survivors of sexual violence for every one about women lying about rape, right? If he really cares about young men and boys.
I think there's time for maybe one more quick question. Yeah, this lady here, did you have a question?
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I think maybe a comment, a resource, and a question very quickly. Just a comment on, over the last month and a half, I was reviewing the UK digital sector plan that was published, and gender wasn't mentioned and climate wasn't mentioned at all. And yeah, I just thought, as I was developing an application for something, that was quite shocking, but also somehow not. In terms of the investing, I think, Julian, I had 2X Global is a really wonderful gender lens investing organization that helps with reviewing investments and making sure that there's gender centered within the investment making process as well as in the investment itself. So 2X Global. 2X. So just sharing that for anyone who invests. And then my question is, when you brought up the manosphere, it made me think of another event that I went to a few months back, and it was a publication on this. And one of the speakers a male goes into schools and does these kind of empathy and social connection groups with other young men in high school. And he made the comment when I was talking with him that they don't hire women for their organization, that it's explicitly a men's job, which I think at kind of that group level makes sense. But it just got me thinking and curious. And I was curious about your reflection on that, where these like spaces where maybe we need to carve out for men and boys to have those conversations with each other. Should women be involved at all?
Well, actually, there's really good research around this. For a long time, it was thought that single-sex spaces were the way to go on this. Men needed to talk to men about it, and women needed safe spaces where they could talk about their experiences. And then, about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the thinking really shifted the other way. Like, how can we not talk to each other about this? How are men ever going to learn? How are boys ever going to learn if they're not listening to what girls are going through? The most recent research really, really clearly shows that the optimal is a mixture of both, where it's possible. We know that there are circumstances in which men and boys, particularly if they really have been quite radicalized or gone down a pathway towards extreme misogyny online, are more likely to be reached in the first instance by a man, particularly a male role model in their lives, whether that be a family member or a teacher, and feel more able to have those conversations in front of other boys. We also know that there are young women and girls who might themselves be survivors of violence, who might not feel able to talk about that, particularly if it is an environment in which, you know, there is sexism and harassment happening. But there's also really good evidence that once that initial work is being done and there is more of an openness to have the conversation and to listen, then there's an opportunity for kind of really rich conversations from coming together. I mean, this was so exemplified for me recently. I went to a school where it was a girls' school and there was a nearby boys' school, and they did events together sometimes. And this event where I was speaking was one of those. And the girls told me that when they'd been in their lessons that morning, they'd seen that the boys were posting on social media that they were planning to be really disruptive in the event. They were saying, you know, some fucking bitch is coming to tell us about how she hates men, you know, why should we listen, and so on. So these girls, instead of going and telling a teacher, they turned up at the auditorium where the lecture was being held about 10 minutes early, and they arranged themselves in every other seat throughout the entire auditorium. And so when the boys' school arrived, where they usually would have kind of been in a big group at the back, sort of jeering and shouting, they had to sit, every single one of them, in between two girls. And once that kind of barrier of the idea of having to present this masculine united front was broken down and kind of washed away, we had really good, vulnerable, open conversations. So there is absolutely value in that I've seen firsthand. But I think sometimes having it be men who take on the burden of starting what can be a very difficult first step can be a useful way to begin.
It's such an interesting idea, because that is exactly what your book shows that you don't get in the online space.
Yes.
Those barriers, those, you know, it's just a clamour of voices. Very sadly, that is, I think, all we've got time for this evening, but thank you for brilliant questions, and truly thank you, Laura, because as I said at the start, your research and your work and your just sort of tireless campaigning and activism in this area is just invaluable, and we've only scratched the surface, so thank you very much. Thank you.